Today on the Roundhouse, it's train time. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Kozarak, and this is episode number 132 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. The Roundhouse is a Streamliner Media production, a digital media and video company that can help you to promote your product, tourist railroad, museum, freight railroad, whatever you need, we streamline the process. Today, we're talking to Stephen Lowe, the director of the new IMAX movie Train Time. If that name sounds familiar, it's because we've had him on the show previously to talk about his other train film, Rocky Mountain Express, my all-time favorite film, period. Train Time looks at the BNSF and modern-day railroading in a very wide scale. Before we get to that, though, I want to thank you guys who are supporting the Roundhouse podcast on Patreon. Patreon.com/theroundhouse. For as little as $1 a month, you're going a long way to supporting the show, including loco fitter Anthony Esposito. Anthony, at $5 a month, is getting early access to episodes like this one. And I'm pleased to announce that now at $10 a month, you get a free magnet. Roundhouse podcast logo magnet for your fridge. This is a good quality one, not one of those flimsy, floppy ones. This is a good magnet. And I just got them in. They will be available for ordering soon, but if you want to get one sooner rather than later, go to patreon.com/surroundus, and for $10 a month, I'll send one to you right away. I'd also like to thank the sponsors of today's episode. First, the Strasburg Railroad. Learn more about how their mechanical services department can help with your restoration project by emailing mechanical@strasburgrailroad.com. And Rail and Road Auctions, which specializes in railroad collectibles and memorabilia. You can see what auctions they have coming up at bidrar.com. Our guest today is the director of Train Time, an IMAX movie experience focusing on modern-day railroading, Burlington Northern Santa Fe. We've had him on the show before to talk about his previous film, Rocky Mountain Express. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Mr. Stephen Lowe.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
It's great to have you on the show again, Stephen. I think when we recorded your last interview is, I think, 2012, a year or so after Rocky had come out. Now we're talking not that long after Train Time came out in March of 2023. I'm curious what the genesis for that film was coming off of Rocky Mountain Express.
Well, the Rocky Mountain Express was really a Canadian story, although I would argue, we have argued to American theaters that, it's a Canadian story, but the hero is an American. And but we still had, many American theaters ran Rocky, I think almost all of them. But we still had people saying, well, why don't you do an American one? And so we began around that time after we finished Rocky. It's always sort of double-edged sword to, if you have a film that you can show off, then you could potentially use that to raise more money to do something else. But then you might say, well, you've already done it. So, but to be able to show, finished IMAX film and say, well, we're going to do something like this, but more in line with, your theater and your region and your story than Rocky was. So, The actual genesis, I don't really remember because it's so long ago. But there was kind of a sense that, oh well, wait a minute. We approached three or four of the big American railroads uh, um, as a potential sponsor and facilitator of another film. Um, and one of them was Union Pacific, and we had multi-month discussions with them. Um, there was a rumor that Warren Buffett had seen Rocky in Omaha, and that might be a potential sponsor. I don't know if that's true. I don't even know if he's seen Train Time yet. But uh, anyway, we eventually talked BNSF into sponsoring the film, and more importantly than even the sponsor money was the access to a huge American railroad for extensive shooting. So it's kind of, we sort of think of it as a miracle that we were able to get their interest and get their enthusiasm to do the film, because railroads are very busy doing their thing. It's expensive to interfere with that when they're, in some cases in the shooting, their tracks were gridlocked and they were, incredibly busy. And so anytime you delay a freight train, the money involved is profound. So we had to work carefully within their schedules and within what they were willing to do. But in general, it worked out really well. I mean, they gave us a train, a business train with a dining car and a full kind of service for the crew for about 4 weeks. And in that time we did a loop around the whole system from Chicago all the way around to LA and back up on the Great Northern and back to Chicago. And so we were able to feature a lot of the at least from a single train's perspective, a lot of the system. Now we had to go back and shoot a lot of helicopter stuff, which was done separately. Anyway, that's I think it's very rare for a railroad to open up like that and give somebody full access. It doesn't happen on feature films very often because the cost is just so high. If a feature with a big crew really needs to control what they're doing, they can't sit around wait for trains or wait for a hole in the schedule. So typically, they will only have a several days of shooting, which would cost them a few $1 million probably to rent a train for a few days. But of course, we had incredible access over 4 years, and the value of that financially is immeasurable.
Let's look at the financial side a little bit, because this is something that I'm intrigued about from a business perspective. The difference between trying to get the backing or launching an IMAX project versus a traditional movie cinema project. It seems when I look at where Rocky played historically and some of the venues that are now playing Train Time, the large percentage of these places are science centers because they have the IMAX infrastructure. So with that in mind, science centers are trying to cater to families. So it seems to me that when you're pitching a film for financiers or whoever you need to in order to get the production rolling, that part of the pitch is being able to take whatever it is you're explaining, whether it be something in outer space or dinosaurs, or in this case, trains, and making it relatable to all ages. Is that true?
Yes, absolutely. Not really just all ages. I mean, yeah, you have to do that, but there's a very specific age group profile in IMAX, which in the science theaters, not the blow up Hollywood theaters, where they call it IMAX, but it's really just blowing up 35 millimeter. So in the real science centers that are running IMAX films, we fulfill a sort of educational slot, and our typical audience is, kind of, I forget exactly. It varies somewhat from theater to theater, but it's somewhere in the sort of 8-year-old, 10-year-old slot, and um, so yeah, you have to figure a way of making a complicated subject simple and compelling enough for young people who might not know anything about uh, science or in this case railroads or whatever it is, and that's not easy to do. I think Rocky was easier in some respects. It was harder to do because we only had one steam engine and one train, and we weren't intending to include the freight railroad system except maybe in the credits. But it was really a story of a steam engine making its way across the mountains, and that has its own set of problems because, uh, like the BNSF, CP doesn't want you delaying freight trains, and so if we were filming with a helicopter, we'd have to land. We only had 3-minute loads, and that's true on this film as well. So you have to land the helicopter every 3 minutes of raw stock, and then every second load you had to refuel the helicopter. And then you have to go, in the case of Rocky, you have to go find your steam train. In the case of BNSF, it was easier because there are a lot of trains. I mean, there's a train every few minutes, and so if you miss one, if you don't like the light, um, if it's overcast or raining or something, you just sit it out and wait. But if you got a steam engine that's headed across the line, you have to find it, and not only that, you have to make sure that um, in out in front of the train that there's no obstacles that your helicopter can run into, and so you have to find the train, go ahead, come back, make sure that the line's clear, and then come back and film it, and then go and reload again. So that makes it really difficult. Um, Typically in the BNSF, in train time, we didn't have to. We thought we might have to, but we didn't have to delay trains when we were shooting with the helicopter. Um, there was some talk of slowing a train down or speeding it up or something to get at a specific bridge or something at the right time. But we found that it was probably easier just to wait for another train, um, than try to schedule something. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. Um, Very, very spectacular way to see the country. I mean, we did a lot of helicopter flying, and railroads are quite spectacular from the air. Um, there's a benefit to trains in that they're winding themselves around the rocks and mountains and whatever it um, is fine in IMAX. It looks great in IMAX because if there's some distortion because of the scale or because it's in a dome, trains wind around things anyway, so the distortion doesn't bother you, which is kind of a nice side effect of of the topic. But it's also fantastically epic. I mean, you can shoot anywhere in the country, almost anywhere you can find freight trains, and some of the most spectacular scenery. Um, and it's so varied that it's a story in its own right. The geography of America is kind of the the trip across America, and then up on the northern route to Seattle and back across to Chicago is just fantastic.
It is. And being able to appreciate that from the sky. Since Rocky came out, we've continued to see the proliferation of drones and drone videography. So seeing shots from the sky is not as novel as it was when Rocky came out. But that said, your film is a testament to why putting a helicopter in the air and doing it the quote unquote old fashioned way is worth it. My favorite moment of your aerial cinematography, and I'm wondering if you could talk about the process of shooting this scene in particular, is when we transition from the opening scene with the kids and the tin plate, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But when we open on the Chicago Intermodal Terminal at night, that was just such a wonderfully impactful moment to transition into that and see all the lights from looking down on the ground and seeing all the vehicles moving around and the mixture of noises. What did it take to be able to pull that off? Because obviously with night photography, you're working with less light.
Yeah, I have to admit that the night stuff was done with digital cameras with the Venice 6K for that reason that the ISO, they call it now, is much higher in digital than film, unless you kind of slow down a film camera to get extra light. But then you can't do much of that because it doesn't look good. So yeah, digital cameras can be fantastic in that at night, especially. Just to give you an idea, on Rocky, we lit a night scene. I guess it was supposed to be golden in BC, and so we brought in a team of lighting guys from I guess Calgary, and it cost us 3 days of setting up the lights, shooting one night, and then packing it all in. It cost us way over $100,000. Now, if that had been digital, it would have cost a dramatically less money, just because of the ISO, because they're very high performance in the dark. Would it have been as good? Probably not, because there's an advantage to having a lot of light and being able to manipulate it. But you make a good point about that. The helicopters and drones, you're right. I mean, for many years, our sort of one of our expertises was aerial photography with gyro stabilized helicopter mounts and stuff. And then to see almost every movie, every streamer now has aerials. It's it's kind of daunting. I think I tried to use I've tried to use drones in the past, but I find it very difficult to do properly because you're not there. You don't have a situational awareness in the same way you do if you're in the helicopter. And so the teamwork between three guys that are sitting in a helicopter, and who are aware of where we are and how the shot is unfolding, to be able to discuss that on the fly with the pilot and the camera operator, that's invaluable, and that's hard to do with a drone. I think at least I find drones difficult. They're easy to do that 3/4 shot that you see in every streamer now, which is kind of looking down, but mainly forward to reduce the strobing. But really elaborate stuff is hard to do with drones, like really dramatic camera moves and stuff. For one reason, they're so slow. the helicopter we're using is it's sort of like a fighter plane. It does 120 knots and more if you're diving. I don't think there's a drone that does anywhere near that. So if you have the money and you have a great pilot that will keep you alive, it's probably in general it's better to use a helicopter.
Yes, well, keeping it alive being the first priority, but being able to have extra pairs of eyes and focus is so important. I'm a licensed drone pilot, and it's true that even when I have somebody to work with who could be a visual spotter for things, the maneuverability that is afforded when you're able to work with other crew, and especially in the air, and you're there physically, you're not having to look through an electronic device to see what the camera's seeing in the same way that you can look out a window, makes a complete difference.
We have a couple of shots in drone shots in train time that where they're doing grade work from after a flood. That stuff was recorded by BNSF's own teams that go around, and they do a lot of filming of accidents and stuff as for reference for the railroad. And so there's a couple of shots there that are drone, and but they're very, very high res, and we up res them, and they look really good.
That makes sense, because I was wondering about that. The other scene in particular that involved the elements that I was wondering how you were able to work around that was the snow fighting scene, because the way that you've got these pacing shots running alongside the plow is just really spectacular. It's stuff like that where I haven't seen that perspective before with railroading. How were you able to work that out?
Well, we just ran in some shots. There was another train we were using to do tracking shots, and there are several shots that are done from the back of a pickup truck. So it depends on if you've got really heavy snow, you've got no way to get to do tracking shots unless you're on rails with another locomotive. So it's a mix of the two, and there's always I always kind of regret that there's always shots that you could do if you had a helicopter, or you're always looking to get better shots than that. But I'm very pleased that people like that scene. It was very difficult to do because at the time I think we were working out of Essex, Montana, which has a hotel there, the Isaac Walton, I think it's called. And what happened is the trains were backed up so long. The pass was blocked for 3 or 4 days, and the trains were backing up, like 100 trains or something were backed up across the country, across the northern transcon, and so we were not appreciated that much from the railroad's point of view. I mean, we had to be really careful to stay out of everybody's way. But we managed to get that far, so I guess that's a good thing.
You'd built that level of trust with them. Speaking of the railroad, looking at the large picture of collaboration, how is working with BNSF similar and different from working with Canadian Pacific for Rocky Mountain Express?
Well, I sort of covered that in the sense of their different challenges. There was a lot more accessibility to the BNSF because the topic was so much broader. That here weren't depending. The scary thing on with the CPR is that, as with most steam programs, they're always teetering on extinction, right? So we'd film for a couple of weeks in one year, and then there was always rumors that they would not run the next year. That was scary for us because we were millions of dollars in our out of pocket, and if the CPR had said, "Well, we decided not to run the engine," we would have been really in trouble. In the case of BNSF, the problem with it is it's such a huge railroad, and there's so many elements to it, and the routes are complicated. The story is not as simple as the CPR. The CPR is wonderfully simple, that they built the railroad really in the wrong place, in the most difficult part of the mountains. And if they'd failed in those passes, the country would have failed. Canada had really invested all their money in this crazy transcontinental, it's always interesting to see where the breaking point would be. And in the case of the CPR, it would have been either Rogers Pass or the Kicking Horse Pass. But the BNSF story was kind of more difficult in the sense that how do you turn these thousands of trains and thousands of employees into some sort of a story? And I guess what pleases me the most is often the search for structure is really in the simplicity to find the real simplicity of something, especially for IMAX, because it's not driven as much by narrative and voiceover as is television, for example, where it's sort of half a radio show and half visual, whereas IMAX is sort of 90% visual. And so the structure has to be really good to not depend so much on the narration. You can't talk your way around things. So I guess, having been a railroader, I realized that the tricky thing is, could you follow one train on this big loop around this conveyor belt around America? And train buffs know that there's several ways that trains are defined. One is in their schedule, and the other one is in their road number of the lead locomotive. And so I figured, well, it's plausible that if you keep the locomotive on the front of the train, that you could depict a train going through many terminals and still remain the same train, at least in the mind of the audience. And the BNSF found that valid. They found that was okay. So this locomotive just remained on the front, and because it's our locomotive, because they gave it to us for almost a month, we were able to sustain the road number through the whole film. Is it really accurate? No, not really, because freight trains terminate when they go through the terminus, and then they reemerge, the next day as a different train. But I think everybody was happy with that sort of device. It's a little bit gimmicky, but it is plausible that a locomotive could remain on the front of a train and go around America like that. So I was very pleased to find a simple way, because it was kind of a year of trying to figure out a way that it wasn't going to be just a hodgepodge of unrelated kind of stuff, that we would have a sense that we were on a specific journey somewhere. And so I'm very pleased with that.
The Strasburg Railroad is an institution in the heritage railroad industry, and its mechanical services department is proud to lead the way. With the knowledge and experience that has created one of the most reliable steam railroading experiences in the country, the Strasburg Railroad is excited to offer their expertise to the rest of the industry. Strasburg's professional team provides consulting and technical assistance to take your steam locomotive or railcar project from idea to finished product. They stand behind their work and always strive to meet their customers' needs for quality, historic accuracy, and reliability at a price that is fair. Unlike many competitors, they feature a fully equipped boiler, railcar, and machine shop, so the work gets done in-house, helping you to get more for your money. Send your inquiries to mechanical@strasburgrailroad.com and let the professionals get to work for you. I can imagine the challenge of trying to figure out the structure because, as you say, class ones, there are so many different parts to the network and there's so many different parts to the operation. And you're trying to encapsulate everything from here's the geography it's going through to the history to here's the technology and the dispatching and all of these systems. It's a lot. And so, yeah, certainly tricky to be able to find something that can anchor the audience through all of these different vignettes.
Yeah, that's what it is. And it's not sort of an anchor. It's a continuity anchor that holds the thing together. Otherwise, it's just a day in the life of a railroad. But railroads don't exist in a day. Their journey is in weeks and months, and we talked to the railroad about a sort of day in the life of a crew and all the things that happen. But they said, well, that's not really our story. We're a conveyor belt. We're nonstop. We go around the clock, and so look for something else, and I did.
Your star of the story then becomes BNSF number 3819, one of the new GEVO style locomotives. You said earlier that they gave you a month to use that engine with their executive fleet. Is that correct?
Well, there were several occasions. They gave us a small train, which had two locomotives. I wanted to be able to shoot back at other units than a single unit. So they gave us two units for the front, and then 4 or 5 cars, business cars, that we were able to sleep in and use for the equipment. And then when we did the daylight scene, they brought the business train, like the full set of business cars from Chicago, and we were able to use those cars. We didn't have real daylight cars. I don't think there are enough left. But the business train looks fine. It's in the right era. Like it's kind of 50s style stainless train, so it kind of fits with the daylight. The daylight was a bit of a controversy because I wanted to use the daylight because I loved the scenery and in that region and along the Columbia River. But also I like the engine. The engine's really an iconic and very distinctive locomotive, unlike a lot of the big black Northerns that the Santa Fe Northern, and there's a whole bunch of them that all kind of look the same. And so it also was bright orange, which fits with the 3819 as well. And so in the back of your head, you're thinking, well, this could have been the BNSF in the 20s or 30s, or I guess in the case of that, it's in the 40s. But it wasn't a BNSF railroad, heritage railroad, and BNSF was kind of keen to stick with the heritage railroads like the Great Northern and the Santa Fe. But I thought it was important to be very distinctive, and I love the guys up in Portland. Doyle McCormick and his group are fantastic to work with. Now I've always been interested in wanting to meet him and get to know that gang. So we chose the daylight. And I think it was a good choice. I mean, I think little kids, that's something that they can really connect with. It's a very, very distinctive engine. So that's what we chose.
I can imagine Doyle being very happy that he got to star alongside his locomotive again in a major film since Tough Guys.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Oh, I think the whole gang was really pleased to do it, and they were wonderful to work with. We had a great time. And it was almost a week of shooting, I think.
So was that solely just you having positioning moves, essentially just having the train go from one place to another and following with the helicopter or your roadside crews? Or were there any actual excursion elements or executives there to be able to take the scenery from a logistical standpoint?
We had executives from the railroad on the train, who proved invaluable in delaying the train, maneuvering it This was a case where we really needed, because we were not going to be shooting for weeks like the CPR. We really needed to control the train. And so that was probably the most contentious thing we did, because we had weather to worry about. We had rain. We can't film in the rain, in a helicopter, um, and you don't really want to anyway. You're really looking for those bursts of sunlight, which we got, but we got that because the railroad dug in and said, no, we're going to do this properly, and they did. So we held up a lot of trains. It was pretty hairy, but I explained that either it's going to be beautiful or it's not, and you got to wait for the light, and they did. And I will say the CPR did that as well, but not very often, but occasionally they were willing to wait for light. Light is so important on a giant screen. It's much more important than streamers or television or Hollywood. It's like if the shot's dull, it's horrible on a huge screen. So we really needed them to, and it's not simple. It's not like the management sort of just you know intervenes and takes over. What you're dealing with is the people in that subdivision who are not necessarily happy, and not necessarily, I mean, they know that the film is endorsed, but other than that, they have their job to do. And so there's not always happiness when a film crew comes in there and delays their trains. So but luckily it worked out great, and I'm very pleased. We have a lot of extra footage, so maybe we'll make a daylight film at some point.
Ooh, that would be fun. And I was seeing leftover footage that I hadn't seen previously of 2816 used in this film, so I'm all in it for the deleted scenes, director's cut, whatever that may look like. I am all in for that.
Well, we've been talking about a kind of I think it was called Giants of Steam, that we're still kind of thinking of doing that, which is to tell a story of maybe 5 or 6 Steam programs, and the Giants are really the people that keep them going, and raise the money, and figure out this old technology that no one else is interested in, and they become passionate and become expert at running these engines. I think you never know. I mean, the way the world is going, that complexity of globalism and all that stuff may well unwind in the near future, and then you'll be left with railroads. I think, because railroads are dramatically more efficient than aviation and shipping and anything else. Well, not shipping. Shipping's pretty efficient, but at very slow speed. Trains are effective and energy efficient at higher speeds, very high speeds. So that's kind of my passion, is to communicate that. We're hoping that to have screenings in important places like Washington, like the Air and Space Museum and the Hazy there in Washington, always or has often run my films, and so I get a chance to talk to people from Congress and stuff, and I fully intend to promote the railroad industry because I think it's it's the future. We can't continue to waste energy, and I think if you can move something at 10 times better efficiency, then and that's what's going to happen.
A core element of what you're doing through that is storytelling. You can have, especially on the governmental level, you can have proposals, you can have written ideas, you can even maybe have photographs. And I know this from my own work as part of Streamliner Media, my company, that you can have these detail elements and there's nothing wrong with them, but nothing sells a concept like having a narrative and having a story. And even if it's not directly tied into something that the individual you're trying to persuade one another is involved with, just being able to sell the concept that here's why trains matter, here's why they are important from an economic standpoint, historical standpoint, cultural, all these different elements, things that you touch on in Train Time, is really important because it's very easy for people who are not in love with trains as we are to forget that. And so the advocacy that these things could do, even where, as you say, Rocky Mountain Express was a Canadian film, but there's absolutely elements of that that hold true to American railroading in general.
Yeah, all railroading around the world, it's relevant. Any kind of railroad story is kind of global.
Certainly. And a key point of that story is people. When we talked about Rocky Mountain Express, I remember you saying that when you were discussing that with the CP crew who ran the engine, that there was kind of this consensus that the engine is the star, the story, the historical context is the star. So there was a deliberate, you see the people on screen, but they're never named or identified in it or following specific individuals at all. With this film, with Train Time, you have a narrator who, unlike the narrator in Rocky, who's sort of a third person omniscient, here's the grand overview of what happened. Your narrator here, younger voice, has more of a contemporary sort of, this is what I do, places himself as a railroader. And you occasionally hear voices that are talking to other perspectives of railroading, whether they be conductors, dispatchers, maintenance of way crew. But it's from somebody who knows film and knows railroading, I could see where, especially because those voices aren't identified, it seems like there was a process for taking railroader stories and then translating that into script that then were read by voice actors. I'm curious as to how that process evolved.
Well, that was a mix of real voices and actors, where the railroad wanted to make some changes. We the idea of trying to track down employees who were scattered all over the country just was not doable. So in certain cases, not all cases, but we did have notes of what everybody said about their jobs and stuff, and we used those notes to write the commentary, write the voiceover, I should say. And then we had actors improvise. So the thing is to get them talking in their own voice, which is not necessarily easy to do for actors, but some do it very well. So yeah, it's kind of a mix. You can't get them to necessarily read the narration. You have to get them to improvise, make themselves into the character, and then put what we'd written into their own words, and that gets it feeling closer to natural. I think, anyway.
This episode of The Roundhouse is brought to you by Rail and Road Auctions. You can find all types of railroad collectibles, including signs, signals, horns, locks, keys, lanterns, timetables, passes, and more. With opening bids of only $10 on many lots, you'll be sure to find something to add to your collection or train room. Rail and Road also offers fast and easy shipping right to your doorstep, and they combine multiple live and online sales methods to allow you a variety of purchasing options. Now, they have an app for both Apple and Android devices that allows for pre-bidding and live bidding on auction days. Their next auction is on June 15th and 16th, 2023, and you can view the full catalog now at www.bidrar.com. That's bidrar.com. Rail and Road Auctions, where real railroaders and rail fans build their collection. There's times when we do see particular individuals on screen and they're talking to their perspective. So one of the first people that we're introduced to is this woman who's an engineer, and she talks about how she grew up with her brother saying trains are a guy's thing, and she didn't really take much heed to that and become a railroader anyway. So was that, because we're hearing her in voiceover as opposed to seeing her speaking to camera directly, was that particular woman's experience, or was that kind of that composite of experiences together for what female engineers have identified?
Yeah, so we sort of straddled both. We tried to, I think in that case, yeah, that I remember that story about the brother, and it's kind of a little bit, well, not so much anymore, but it's kind of toy trains were thought in the old days to be a boy thing. But I've noticed, I've been to some model train shows, and little girls are just crazy about these Thomas the Tank Engine and the wooden Brio sets that little kids can figure out. They got magnet couplings, and they fit into these wooden grooves. I have a brand new granddaughter, and she's just crazy about her little train set. At first, we were thinking, well, we always try to be inclusive in the films, and so if we find somebody in the middle of whatever it is, an aircraft carrier or a fighter plane, or whatever we're doing, we go out of our way to sort of be inclusive. But in this case, there are a lot of employees a lot of female employees, a lot of diversity on the BNSF, and so it wasn't hard to find a whole mixture of people from all kind of walks of life and minority groups and everything. It was fantastic that way. So I think the other thing is that you hear a lot of people complaining about when the railroads are kind of fighting with the unions and stuff, but I didn't see the kind of unhappiness that I remember from the old days. I think that the people that worked for the BNSF were really keen on their jobs. I mean, there wasn't one person and we were alone with these people. They weren't being monitored by management or anything, and they were really keen on their jobs, and they really loved the lifestyle. And so I think the public rarely hears that kind of positive thing, and I thought, we'll tell that story. The other thing, you ask why we started with the train in the basement, is that virtually everybody, we shot that scene afterwards, after we finished the film, basically, and almost everybody on through the whole tour of all the dozens and dozens of employees, they all had toy trains in the basement. I asked that question to everybody. Why did you end up on the railroad? Well, I had a toy train. I mean, that was almost universal. It was very hard to find somebody who didn't start that way. And I thought that's fascinating, that the stuff you do for your children, the time you spend playing with them, and uh, um, taking note of the kind of the things they're interested in, and getting them engaged in life is so important. That the difference between a kid that loves trains and a kid that doesn't enjoy his or her job is profound. It's a big deal. I never had anything but fun on the railroad. When I was a kid, I hired onto the CPR and worked in a car shop. I worked as a switchman, brakeman, trainman, and I just loved every minute of it. Even though a lot of it's very hard and painful. You get up in the middle of the night and you have to work. In those days, we ran across the top of boxcars and jumped between them, and we weren't allowed to use radios. We had to use lights, lanterns, like in the like in the medieval times. Um, but I loved it. I just loved it, and it's because my family, my father, um, introduced us to all kinds of wonderful stuff. And as a kid, even though I didn't have any money, I never felt poor because I could always enjoy these things. To me, walking down, to a railroad yard was heaven. I mean, I just loved it. Um, so I think it's a broader message. It's not just train related. That it applies to everything. That when you get kids excited about life, that sets them up not for potentially a great career. Like if you don't have any passion like that, then how do you get connected? I mean, how do you know where to get a job? How do you know what direction to head in? You really don't. Um, unless you've been introduced to things and you've become passionate. And trains are wonderful because they're accessible. Because every city has them. You can go and watch them. You can build model trains. There's all kinds of ways to get connected.
Yeah, it's a very approachable subject because everybody has some sort of relationship in some way. And sometimes, unfortunately, that extent of relationship is it holds me up 5 minutes when I'm trying to commute to work. But to be able to show things behind that and give it more a time of day is part of the benefit of this. And showing the benefits of play and drawing that connection between the play that we have as kids and how that instills certain passions within us and guides us into what we do. When you filmed that opening scene, the two elements that I really liked about it, number one, using tin plate, which I'm guessing you chose because it's one of the bigger scales out there, so it would show up really well on camera, and the ways in which you're able to follow the trains around with these presumably large IMAX cameras, if you were shooting that on film as well, add the sort of dreamlike nature to it. So you see the kids playing, but it's not in just a conventional basement. There's a lot of fog and mood lighting, and you hear these sort of dreamy xylophone music. So it's playing into that. Even if people didn't play with trains as a kid, most people had at least some exposure to trains on some level, whether it be Thomas or something else. So being able to play into that and that mental space of nostalgia, and then, as we were talking about earlier, cutting to the cold, hard reality of not cold or hard, but the concrete reality of being at this intermodal container facility at night.
Yeah, it's a match with the toy train, which we didn't. I don't think we planned that. I think that we just saw it right away in the cutting room. We said, because there's a lot of options to cut from. You can cut almost anywhere into the film, and open it to have an opening shot. And actually, many other shots worked as well because of the helicopter's perspective is like your own. It kind of supports the miniaturization aspect of toy trains, and so do helicopters. But anyway, you asked me about standard gauge, and I've sort of collected that for quite a long time. I have a silly rule with my toy trains that if a train is a steam engine, it should be a steam engine. So I have a collection of live steam engines, Asters, the Japanese live steam engines, and then I also collect electric. So it has to be a steam engine if it's a steam engine, and it has to be electric if it's an electric engine. So that sort of leaves the diesel thing behind because there's no easy way to do that. But I have a quite a nice collection of standard gauge Lionel from pre-war, from the 30s and 20s, I guess. And the interesting thing is that the Chinese, I guess it's through Mike MTH or something, that they make replicas that are really beautiful, but they're not as robust as the old ones. So we found that after a week of shooting, all the new stuff was broken. But the old Lionel stuff was just bulletproof. It was fantastic. I mean, we didn't damage any of that.
And I'm sure the kids must have had a lot of fun during that filming.
Yeah. Well, yeah. It was a hoot.
You spend 4 years filming this collectively, and you get to the stage of editing. Going into the edit, how much of a map of assembly did you have in your mind of this is the way that it's going to go together, and how much of it was determined based on actually looking through the material and determining how scenes fit together?
Well, it's a combination of both. In nonfiction, it's usually both. I mean, you should have a pretty strong idea of how the film's going to work before you start shooting, which I do. But you're silly to not take advantage of things that could be better than the script. So it's a mix. You have to have a strong idea, but then when you have to be opportunistic as well, and so you see new things every day because you're in that world, right? So you're seeing things all the time that you've never seen before. You're not just sitting in your apartment writing, imagining all this stuff like you do a feature film. You're actually living it, which is the wonderful side of documentary filmmaking. And I wouldn't give it up for anything, because I got to know the real people and real scientists and real stories, and I lived the life of these people as you're making the film, and that's just not unbeatable. I've had quite a few Hollywood directors say to me, kind of jealously, that they would have preferred to be documentary filmmakers, but it's hard to make a living in documentary. I started on working in Hollywood, and I got bored because you're dealing with sets that aren't real and actors that aren't real and don't become interesting until they start reading their lines, but they're not that interesting before they're being filmed. They're just actors, right? So, I mean, compare that to, people doing real science and real railroad people and real whatever it is, fighter pilots or race car drivers, or, there's nothing like the real thing. So that's my pitch, but I think the process of making a living in documentary is getting more and more difficult.
It is, which is a shame, because I think especially in this day and age where we're inundated in media, it's so refreshing to have authentic stories that are presented, that are real people and real perspectives, that require the immersion that is part of the documentary filmmaking discipline, as opposed to just, say, a 3-minute vignette into a thing where the crew maybe only had to spend an hour. And sometimes that's all you get. But when you could get to know your subject matter really well, when you could get to know the people behind it, when you're getting to film somebody who's genuinely enthusiastic, to your point about sets, it's also actors, is that they are acting. And that's its own kind of magic. But there's a particular magic to when you are engaged in conversation with somebody who's explaining a concept to you and they're really excited about it. And I think that that's so important to the documentary tradition.
Yeah, I think I would add that we have been in a unique position of doing theatrical documentary. If you follow the history of cinema, it's really the theatrical, high engineered films were all dramas. They weren't documentaries. But to get, in the case of IMAX, we had money that it didn't really compare to Hollywood, but at least it was money to really film things properly, with helicopters and mounts and all the and lighting and all the expensive equipment that Hollywood uses. But our technology was even better because IMAX was 10 times higher quality than 35 millimeter. So this kind of theatrical stuff, now it's just sort of documentaries going back into the television realm, and a lot of it is very low budget. It's not highly engineered, which is fine. I mean, you can, if the films are cheaper, you can, and the cameras are easier to use, and there's less lighting. There's all kinds of advantages to that. But putting really big, spectacular images on a giant screen with 12-channel sound, that's a shame that's getting harder and harder and more expensive to do.
It is something, from what you described earlier, that it sounds like you still very much have future plans. You mentioned this Giants of Steam concept. What are some things that you're looking for in your filmmaking future?
Well, first of all, you have to have an audience, and so we have to see how, if anybody wants another train film. People are already sort of making fun of us for redoing or remaking stuff, and I say to them, well, I don't know. There's like dozens of space shuttle films and space films, and hundreds of deep ocean or underwater films and whale films. So what's wrong with three train films? That's what I come back with. But I don't know if we've taken a real beating with this with COVID. In fact, this film Train Time was made for some kind of a bicentennial for BNSF that was canceled, and so the plans to do major marketing and stuff all kind of went away with COVID. So anyway, we shouldn't be talking about the future because I can't see into the future, and few people can. So there's a lot of good things about the technology. The non-linear, editing is fantastic compared to the old days when you used to use film, Steenbecks, and it just took so much longer. So there's a lot of good things. It's always a challenge. Money is always a challenge, especially when it's educational film. Companies don't really understand that we're making educational films. We're not making, drama. We're not making consumer type films. We're making educational films for little kids, basically. Which sort of brings us back to where we started the discussion, that the audience is young people a lot of kids who don't have the wherewithal to go on these great trips. When I was a kid, I traveled by train a lot out west to see my grandparents. And a lot of kids don't have that. They don't, well, there are no trains, there are no passenger trains left. And so they don't have the advantage of seeing their own country. You can't see much from an airplane where you're told to shut your window and so people can watch a video. Anyway, you never know. I mean, we may be back to rail because the energy consumption is a tiny fraction of what it is by highway or aviation. And there's a lot of new technology that can make it even better of reducing CO2 is the system's most fixable are railroads. I mean, you can run electricity, windmills, solar, everything can be run easily on rail. And if you don't want to build the electric networks, which I think we're going to have to start rebuilding for railroads, have a kind of mainline electric rail, electric superhighways of electric rail. I think that's the future, and I hope we don't go too far down the garden path with electric cars and trucks and stuff, because they're highly inefficient with gasoline, and they're even worse with batteries. On the other hand, a train can easily accommodate hydrogen. I mean, who cares how many cars you have to use? You're pulling 220 cars. If you have to pull a couple of hydrogen cars, so what? It's a big deal for a ship. It's an even bigger deal for aviation or highways, but it's nothing for trains.
TrainTimeFilm.com is the website. You can see where it's currently playing. But that said, you can always send your local science center that has an IMAX screen a message through email or Facebook and say, hey, I want to see this, and get other people to do the same in your area. Because I had to go all the way up. I had to go all the way to Pittsburgh to see it the first time and to Connecticut for the second. So the Connecticut one was tied in with going to the Springfield train show. So it was convenient enough. And so was the Pittsburgh trip tied in with a business trip. So I made them work, but I don't have it playing yet near me. In Richmond would be the closest one. So I've already messaged them, but you can check out the website. It's worth a few hours drive, even if you have to get out to take a little bit of a hike to get there. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us on the Roundhouse.
Thank you very much, Nick.
And now, the question of the day.
Your question of the day for this episode is, what is your favorite example of a train on film? Could be a train-centric movie, but it could just be a cameo shot of a train in the background. Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com. Links to social media there. Thank you guys for listening, and as always, remember that the Roundhouse is our house.